Hey everybody, this is the Think and Read podcast. I am Tom Vieira. This is a podcast where we think that thinking is worth doing, great books are worth reading. We are in episode 9. It's our first one on the 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who once famously said, "What do I know?" was his life's motto. He wrote a lot of essays. He was, in fact, the founder of the philosophical essay as a kind of genre. And in these essays, he was unapologetic about writing down his own personal thoughts, his own opinions, his own perspectives on a whole bunch of different topics, including the topic that we will focus on today, which is the topic of death. Should we think about death? Should we be afraid of it? And what does philosophy have anything to do with this? I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you want to find more episodes, you can find my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. There's a really strange story told about the death of Aeschylus. He's one of the most famous playwrights in history, the Greek playwright that gave us the Oresteia. In any case, he was given a prophecy, apparently, that he would die of a house falling on him. So he spent a lot of time outside trying to avoid this prophecy. Anyway, he was in Sicily, and one day an eagle flies by and drops a tortoise or a tortoiseshell, lands on Aeschylus's head, killing him. And this strange story is mentioned by Michel de Montaigne in his famous essay on philosophy as preparing to die or learning how to die. All right, so why Montaigne brings this up is interesting and it's important. We'll get to that essay a little bit later. That'll be the main focus of this first episode on Montaigne. But first of all, the story about Aeschylus. Okay, I think there's a couple of clues here in the story that just kind of shed some light on Montaigne as a thinker, as a writer, and that's what I want to do here first, is just introduce him. Now, as a heads up, in the next episode, I will actually tell the story of Montaigne's life. He had a very interesting life, so I will wait for that for the next episode. But first, the fact that Montaigne is referring to some story, kind of semi-legendary story from the classical sort of Greek Roman tradition is not at all surprising. When you read his essays, which was published in 1580, that's what it's called, his essays, there's a ton of references to the classical pagan tradition, and actually, surprisingly and importantly, not a lot from the Christian tradition. You know, you don't get a lot of references to Augustine or Dante or Aquinas or Boethius or somebody else. Rather, there's a ton from Virgil and Ovid and Epicurus and references Socrates, Cicero, and so on. So that already is suggestive of the kind of Renaissance thinker that Montaigne was. He really is sort of going back to the pagan sources and drawing from that a kind of body of wisdom. And in the essay we're going to talk about today, it's wisdom about death, about dying. So I think that's really important. And then secondly, this story, here's Aeschylus, one of the most brilliant minds in all of history. And he dies in this really just odd, unexpected way. And for Montaigne, I think the story just reminds us of what is just so very human about everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. You're going to die, and you aren't going to be able to predict how that will happen. Death comes in all sorts of odd ways, at least sometimes. And one of my favorite lines actually from this essay, he brings up Alexander the Great. And he says that Alexander, the greatest man who was simply man. Okay, so why does that matter? I mean, one of the most crucial themes in Montaigne is just how limited we are, how limited our powers are, and how limited our reason is. And we mentioned Montaigne several times in talking about Pascal. He was influential on Pascal. And it's just this part of Montaigne's thinking I think was particularly interesting and appealing to Pascal, although he will have his own response to Montaigne, and we'll see part of that in this episode today. So, I don't know. When I read Montaigne, he's really interesting because he's like part Socrates, part Seneca, and part Epicurus. And if that list of philosophers is familiar to you, it's not crazy to link Socrates with Seneca. Seneca is the great Roman Stoic philosopher, and the Stoics, on the whole, though there's kind of different phases of the development of Stoicism, but on the whole, the Stoics thought of themselves roughly as the spiritual, like the true spiritual heirs of Socratic philosophy. You know, they got Socrates and are sort of carrying on the true Socratic enterprise of philosophy, unlike skeptics and some others. And, you know, for Socrates, virtue is really, in the Stoics, virtue is really the goal of life, and the happiest person is the virtuous man. And so when I say that Montaigne is like part Socrates and part Seneca, you're like, okay, but then I throw in part Epicurus, and that's like, wait a second, because Epicureanism is the philosophy of pleasure, right? It's the happiest man is the man with the most amount of pleasure, the man who is most successful in achieving pleasure. There's a whole science to that, and I don't want to get into that right now, but the thing that's interesting is that most philosophers pit Epicureanism and Stoicism as philosophical rivals, but you don't find that in Montaigne. Montaigne quotes from these authors readily, and it's seemingly it doesn't really matter to Montaigne what school of thought they come from. And that fits Montaigne. Montaigne himself is not really interested in aligning himself with some school of thought. And he's not really interested in ascribing to some body of philosophical commitments, a sort of grand theory, as it were, or a system of thought. He's just not that type of thinker. And sometimes, I mean, it's fascinating because he drives some really interesting questions, stirring questions, probing questions. And it's also frustrating at times because he will give what seems to us, and maybe that just says something about us, some centuries later and influenced by the rationalism of modern science and so on. But in any case, they seem like half-baked answers. You know, he gives some responses, but he doesn't really thoroughly develop them. But I think when we step back and think about what Montaigne is trying to do, that makes perfect sense for him. He doesn't think there are any final answers. He doesn't think that there are absolutely 100% certain truths. And so, you know, his motto is, what do I know? He had it inscribed and hung around his neck, and he kind of wore that for the last number of years of his life. What do I know? And of course, Descartes is going to come around just a few decades later and say, I'll tell you what we can know for sure, Montaigne, and he's going to give us his cogito. But Montaigne, even if he had lived to see that, would probably still be suspicious of Descartes' project. What do I know? So let's talk now about his essays. The idea of an essay is the idea of an attempt. That's what the word literally means. And so we are pretty used to the essay as a kind of genre. A lot of writers, you know, will write in an essay style as opposed to long develop, you know, what would have been called treatises. Okay, at the time, we might think of them now that way, treatises or dissertations, right? An essay is something much shorter. That is perfectly fitting for what Montaigne is trying to do. We shouldn't expect from Montaigne, given some of the things that we've just said about him, to give long developed responses to interesting topics like death or pleasure or how to raise children and so on. So it's interesting, right? That the idea of an essay or an attempt for Montaigne was just quite simply his effort to put down his honest thoughts about things. He withdrew from society so he wouldn't be influenced by the thoughts of others. And he tells you at the beginning of his essays that his subject, it's not epistemology, it's not ethics or moral theory or anything. He says his subject is himself. And that would have been very new. That would have been very interesting, and would have definitely stirred his readers. We've seen Augustine, for example, the Christian theologian who wrote Confessions. He wrote about himself, but it was really ultimately a story about God and the work of God in converting Augustine, changing his heart and bringing about grace in his life and so on. So it really is ultimately a celebration of God in St. Augustine's Confessions, whereas here it's more accurately a celebration of himself. It's really a explicitly subjectivist take on a lot of different topics without any need to apologize for doing so. The great Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau also wrote a book called Confessions, and he's honestly sort of mocking on some level what Augustine did. He's not really interested in talking about his own conversion or something like that. In fact, Rousseau acknowledges Montaigne as a significant influence on his, sort of thoughts and ramblings about himself. So in any case, Montaigne's subject is himself, and he wants to tell you his opinions, and he's going to be very open about the fact that they're tentative, because what do I know? Again, well, my favorite essay in this collection of essays is on how philosophy is learning how to die. And it's certainly one of his most famous essays. And it's full of witty sayings, just things that could go at the end of an email, for example. He says, life itself is neither good nor evil. Life is where good or evil find a place, depending on how you make it for them. Stuff like that, which just sounds really interesting and potentially profound. Like the saying of some sage or something. And, I do wonder sometimes if Montaigne kind of came across that way a little bit, the sort of reclusive man of broad worldly wisdom that sort of was setting out what he thought about things without any firm commitment, wanting to stir you to thought, more Socrates-like than anything else. So, all right, so let's turn our attention to this essay now. At the very center of this essay is a really, really interesting question. And Montaigne would probably say it's the most important question we could ever ask in life. And it is this: of all the things that we want to avoid thinking about, what is at the top of the list? And he thinks it's death. Death is the last thing that we want to think about. It's the last thing we want to talk about. We are horrified by it. We're deeply terrified by it. Montaigne, in fact, has his own story, a kind of near-death experience, as it were. And so, we would rather talk about a whole lot of other things. This actually came up, if you recall, with Pascal. This is where you can see Montaigne's impact on Pascal. Pascal sort of agrees with Montaigne here, that there really isn't a more important question that we can ask than the question of death. Montaigne, in fact, brings up this really interesting historical note about the Romans. Apparently, the Romans thought the word death sounded too rough to the ear, and it actually brought bad luck, apparently. So they would say things like, he has ceased to live, or he has lived, instead of just using the word death or dead. We say something similar, like he has passed away. Okay, but all of this fear of death and the avoidance of thinking about it and talking about it, for Montaigne, that is a colossal error. That is the last thing we should do. And this is why avoiding talking about death only guarantees that life will be miserable. He writes this: the end of our course is death. It is the objective necessarily within our sights. If death frightens us, how can we go on one step forward without anguish? For ordinary people, the remedy is not to think about it. But what brutish insensitivity can produce so gross a blindness? So the problem, of course, then is that when we don't deal with death, when we don't face it down, the fear of it, the anguish that comes with that fear just remains in us, and it taints every experience of life from here on out. And so his answer to this problem is actually quite interesting, and it's quite simple. That instead of running from death, he says that, we have to remove its strangeness. He writes, to begin depriving death of its greatest advantage over us, let us adopt a way clean contrary to that common one. Let us deprive death of its strangeness. Let us frequent it. Let us get used to it. Let us have nothing more often in our mind than death. At every instant, let us evoke it in our imagination under all its aspects. Whenever a horse stumbles, a tile falls, or a pin pricks, however slightly, let us at once chew over this thought, supposing that was death itself. With that, let us brace ourselves and make an effort. In the midst of joy and feasting, let our refrain be one which recalls our human condition. Let us never be carried away by pleasure so strongly that we fail to recall occasionally how many are the ways in which that joy of ours is subject to death, or how many are the fashions in which death threatens to snatch it away. So let's make death familiar, right? Not strange. The Aeschylus story comes to mind now, right? We hear that story and it's like, oh my goodness, right? It's like, that's frightening that death could come upon us so suddenly, so unexpectedly. Even when we're making our best efforts to avoid it, it just happens like that. And that's very frightening. So how do we make it not so frightening? Well, let's not try to avoid it. Let's think about it. Let's put it in front of us. Let us dwell on it, he says. Make it familiar. Because it's its unfamiliarity, its strangeness is what really masters us. So this is why he adds, we do not know where death awaits us, so let us wait for it everywhere. To practice death, and that's the intellectual discipline. I think I'm gonna get back to here in just a minute. That I find at the core of this essay, practicing death. He says something similar. Skip forward here. I wasn't planning on doing this, but the line is great. He says, your life's continual task is to build your death. Okay. So to practice death, he says, is to practice freedom. A man who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. Knowing how to die gives us freedom from subjection and constraint. Life has no evil for him who has thoroughly understood that loss of life is not an evil. Okay, so there's a clue there about loss of life is not an evil. And so the fear of death is connected to a certain kind of ignorance we have about death. We think death is an evil, it's a bad thing. And he said, it's not a bad thing. More on that in just a moment. But notice, right, that he says, let us wait for death everywhere. One point he mentions, he's actually referring to a pagan temple, but he calls it a church. And he says, this is the reason why cemeteries are right next to churches, that in the place of great joy and feasting and so on, you have weddings in churches and et cetera, right? You're restored to a hope you have and whatever. He says there's also a cemetery right next door, right? To remind us of the great fact about our lives that it will come to an end. And there's something evil about that, he says. So let's get to this idea of ignorance then, that the fear of death is really a kind of ignorance. There's both kind of Socrates and Seneca echoed here in Montaigne. Like if we knew what death was, we really wouldn't be afraid of it. And Montaigne sort of thinks of death as almost not even a thing itself. But death, if we knew what it was, we would rather not occupy ourselves with the fear of it, but we would instead be free to live life. Right? The sting of death is the fear that it carries over. It's not so much like when it happens, but the problem with death is what it does to our living. So he says we're born for action. I want us to be doing things, he writes, prolonging life's duties as much as we can. I want death to find me planting my cabbages, neither worrying about it nor the unfinished gardening. C.S. Lewis has a very similar line when he was talking about the atomic bomb, if I'm not mistaken, and just this kind of technological power of man that can bring an end to life so abruptly for so many people. And he says, if that were to come, let it come while I'm, and he says something very similar, I think, is, tending to the garden, playing with grandchildren, that sort of thing, living life. Okay. And there's something I think common enough about this idea, that we want to not just survive, we want to actually live, and, right, quality of life. We talk about these sorts of things, I think, as a commonplace in our culture today. But for Montaigne, this is where I think philosophy really starts to enter the picture. Because for him, there is a certain kind of mental discipline that we have to exert in order to combat this typical fear that we entertain. And that's what separates the philosopher from everyone else. The philosopher is someone who goes after death mentally and brings himself to recognize its true nature, that it is not an evil. There's a couple passages here that I think come up that are of particular interest. He says that, I'll kind of bounce around in one place. He says, our religion has never had a surer human foundation than contempt for life. Rational argument, though not it alone, summons us to such contempt. For why should we fear to lose something which, once lost, cannot be regretted? And since we are threatened by so many kinds of death, it is not worse to fear them than to bear one. Death is inevitable. Does it matter when it comes? When Socrates was told that the 30 tyrants had condemned him to death, he retorted, and nature them. How absurd to anguish over our passing into freedom from all anguish. So there's a key line right there. Right? For him, death is not an evil, it is the passing into a greater freedom. Just as our birth was the birth of all things for us, our death will be the death of them all. That is why it is equally mad to weep because we shall not be alive 100 years from now, and to weep because we were not alive 100 years ago. Death is the origin of another life. This passage reminded me a lot of the ancient Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. There's a story about Zhuangzi when his wife died. I think it was at some kind of a gathering. I don't quite remember the exact situation, but in any case, one of his closest friends found Zhuangzi playing music and singing as though or something celebratory. And his friend was really bothered. And he asked Zhuangzi, he said, this woman raised your children. You spent your life with her and you're celebrating? It's kind of, he's almost offended. And the Zhuangzi's response is really interesting. And it's very Montaigne-like. He says that he did grieve at first. But then he realized that she had simply emerged from the Tao as one of the 10,000 things and returned thereunto. There's a bit of this idea there, right, that there's some ignorance in his friend and the way his friend is reacting, as though there's something to be grieved here. She's returning to what she once was. She emerged. She was a particular momentary emergence from the Tao, as we all are. And we return to that from whence we came. It's that sort of idea that I think is intriguing to Montaigne. And so it's connected, again, to this idea of ignorance, that we just don't really understand death, and that's why we fear it. And I think here we find a contrast between Montaigne and Zhuangzi, because Zhuangzi would say that the proper response to this is not rational, like mental exertion, where I think Montaigne goes more in that direction. He's more stoic than Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi would emphasize something of acceptance, that what we are to do is to accept the way of things. and not try to impose our categories upon the way of things, or the Tao, categories like good and evil, for example, right? But to accept that things are. I think Montaigne would have us use reason more actively here. That there is the philosopher that needs to emerge at this moment. The philosopher is not the common person. The common person, runs from death, doesn't want to deal with it, right, and is miserable the rest of his life because of it, right? The philosopher is the happy person, precisely because the philosopher confronts the fear, sees that death is part of the way of life. It's not an evil. It's not something to be horrified by, and therefore is freed to live his life. Okay, I think Pascal now becomes interesting. So I want to wrap up this episode with a couple of final thoughts, one of them having to do with Pascal, because I think you can see Montaigne's impact here. Again, Pascal would look at Montaigne as asking exactly the right sort of question. It's like, we can't just run from death. What are we going to say about it? But I think Pascal would ask Montaigne, how do you know that death is freedom from torment? How do you know that death isn't just the beginning of a never-ending kind of torment? You sort of have the wager lurking in the background here of, final judgment, these sorts of things. Like, there's an eternity here, and there's a final judgment that Pascal believes in, that Montaigne leaves sort of ambiguous at best in this essay. And so I think, for Pascal, the fear of death ought to orient you to the eternal question, right? To the question of life after death. What is that going to look like for you? But for Montaigne, the reality of death is something different, right? Or the fear of death, thinking about death, it really ought to, you ought to confront that, face that down so that it can free you to live life now. So Pascal thinks more in terms of the eternal question, whereas Montaigne is primarily interested in a this worldly reality. It frees you to live a happier life now. Okay, so leaving aside the question of life now versus life after you die, there's a second and maybe even more pressing issue here for Montaigne, because a lot of philosophers today would presumably argue that we fear death out of evolutionary instinct. That's something that's been programmed into us, over the hard knocks of evolutionary history coming all the way down to us, such that this fear we have is not a rational thing, but rather an instinctual thing that tends toward survival. This is why we typically want to avoid doing pretty risky things, dumb things, things that would threaten our continuing existence in this world, that sort of thing. Okay, now, look, to be fair to Montaigne, right, we can hardly expect Montaigne to have prepared a response to the challenge of evolutionary biology, which doesn't come about until the 19th century. Fair enough. But on the other hand, I think this does raise an interesting and relevant philosophical issue for Montaigne, because Montaigne looks like he's following Socrates and the Stoics and the Epicureans, in fact, very, very closely on this, that our fear of death is really the result of intellectual failure. That if we just got our head right, if we just got our thinking straight, right? In other words, the problem is ignorance, right? Because if we got our thinking straight, if we actually understood what death is, that it's not an evil, it's access to greater freedom, etc., then we wouldn't fear it. And I think this challenge from evolutionary biology questions that. And again, we can leave aside evolutionary biology itself and not really dive into that. That's not my interest right now. I think the challenge philosophically is something like this, that the fear of death is not necessarily a rational thing. That if we just fixed our reason, then our experience of life free from the fear of death would follow automatically. It doesn't work like that. I think there is a legitimate position to say something like our fear of death is connected to an instinct for life, an instinct that would naturally regard life or this world as a good thing. Life is something worth having, and therefore death is something worth fearing. And I wonder what Montaigne would say about that. I'll leave that to you to think about. Thanks so much for being here. Our question is to think or not to think. Bye for now.